At my husband's funeral, I heard my daughter-in-law whisper, "Speed up the inheritance. I've already made plans." And in that moment, something inside me went very still. I didn't turn around right away, even though her voice had carried clearly across the quiet space behind the chapel doors, cutting through the low hum of polite condolences and the soft rustle of black coats. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the polished oak casket at the front of the room, my gloved hands resting gently on top of one another, as if I hadn't heard a thing. The air smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish, the kind of scent that tries too hard to feel respectful, but only ends up reminding you that everything has been arranged, every chair, every flower, every expression. 42 years of marriage had been reduced to a program printed on thick ivory paper, his name in bold at the top, followed by dates that looked far too small to hold a lifetime. Edward Collins, 1949 to 2026. I repeated it in my mind, as if saying it enough times might stretch those numbers back into something that still felt real. Around me, people shifted quietly in their seats, offering gentle smiles when our eyes met, but no one lingered. Grief, I've learned, makes people uncomfortable when it isn't loud. When you don't cry, when you don't collapse, they don't quite know where to place you. They expect something visible, something easier to understand. I adjusted the sleeve of my black dress, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't exist, and only then allowed myself to glance slightly to the side, just enough to see her reflection in the glass frame of a nearby photograph. Ashley stood near the back, her hand lightly resting on Daniel's arm, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged into something that might pass for sympathy. But I knew that tone. I had heard it before, in quieter moments, in conversations that stopped when I entered the room, in questions that sounded innocent but always seemed to circle back to one thing: money, property, timing. I remembered how, just weeks ago, she had asked Edward if he had everything organized, her voice light, almost playful, as if she were talking about holiday plans instead of legal documents. At the time, I had dismissed it, told myself she was being practical. Young people, I thought, like things in order. But standing there now, with her words still echoing in my ears, I realized there had been nothing casual about it. This wasn't new. This was patient, deliberate. I looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, searching for some sign that he had heard what I had heard, that he understood the weight of it. But he kept his gaze forward, his expression distant, as if he had already stepped into a future that no longer included the man lying just a few feet away. My son, who used to hold my hand when crossing the street, who used to ask me if I thought he'd make a good man someday, now stood beside a woman who measured loss in timelines and transactions. I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not anger, not yet, and not quite sorrow either, but a kind of clarity that arrives quietly, without announcement. The service began a few moments later, the pastor's voice steady and warm as he spoke about legacy and love and the quiet strength of a life well lived. People nodded. Some dabbed at their eyes. I remained still, because the truth was, I had just learned something far more important than anything written in that program. I had learned who had been waiting, and for how long. And as I sat there, listening to words meant to comfort, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided in that room, or by those flowers, or even by the man we were all pretending to say goodbye to. It would be decided by what I chose to do with what I now knew. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath, steady and controlled, as if I were preparing for something that had been set in motion long before this funeral ever began. I remember the way the light fell across the kitchen table the morning after Edward's doctor first mentioned the word decline. Soft and ordinary, as if nothing in the world had shifted, even though everything had. I had been standing at the sink, rinsing out his favorite coffee mug, the one with the faded blue stripe along the rim, when Ashley walked in without knocking, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, too loud for that early hour, too certain. She greeted me with a smile that showed just enough warmth to pass, but not enough to feel real, then set her handbag down on the chair, as if she already belonged there more than I did. "Have you two started organizing things yet?" she asked, her voice light, almost casual, as she reached for a glass from the cabinet I had stocked for decades. I turned to look at her, confused at first, still holding the damp mug in my hands. "Organizing what?" I asked, though something in her tone made my stomach tighten in a way I could not explain. She gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think they are being helpful. "You know, paperwork, accounts, the house. It is better to have everything clear ahead of time. It just makes things easier for everyone." I remember how I nodded slowly, telling myself she was being practical, that younger people thought about these things differently, that it did not mean anything beyond efficiency. Edward had come into the room then, his steps slower than they used to be, his presence still steady but quieter, like a song turned down just enough to notice. He kissed the top of my head and asked what we were talking about, and Ashley repeated her question, this time directing it more toward him. He had smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, and said, "Everything that needs to be taken care of will be taken care of." He did not elaborate, and she did not press, but I saw the brief flicker in her eyes, something calculating, something that lingered a second too long before she smoothed it away. At the time, I chose not to dwell on it. I told myself that grief had not yet entered our home, that we still had time, that there was no reason to look for shadows where there might be none. But after that morning, the questions came more often, always wrapped in politeness, always timed carefully. She would ask Daniel about the house when she thought I was not listening, about whether it was too much space, about whether it might make sense to simplify things. She began offering to help with documents, suggesting that it would be easier if everything were consolidated, if decisions were made early. Each suggestion sounded reasonable on its own, harmless even, but together they formed a pattern I did not want to see. Daniel, for his part, would nod along, distracted, trusting, as if these conversations were no different from discussing weekend plans or grocery lists. He did not notice the way her questions always circled back to ownership, to control, to timing. I did. I noticed, and yet I stayed quiet. Because after 42 years of building a life with Edward, I believed that what we had created could not be undone by quiet conversations in a kitchen. I believed that loyalty, once earned, held its shape. That family meant something solid, something that could not be rearranged by convenience or ambition. Standing now in that chapel, listening to the low murmur of voices and the careful words of remembrance, I realized how much of that belief had been built on silence, on things left unsaid, on trust that had never been tested this way. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my gloves against my skin, and let the memory settle into place beside everything I had just heard. It was no longer a series of small, forgettable moments. It was a line, clear and unbroken, leading directly to where we stood now. And as the pastor spoke about peace and rest and the comfort of faith, I understood that whatever Ashley had been planning did not begin at this funeral. It had only become impossible to ignore. I noticed it fully for the first time during the reception, after the service, when people had begun to relax into softer conversations, and the tension of formal grief had loosened just enough to reveal what sat underneath it. The church hall was filled with the quiet clinking of glassware and the low hum of voices sharing stories about Edward, each one carefully polished, each one ending in the same gentle nod, as if agreement could somehow make loss easier to carry. I stood near the edge of the room with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold in my hands, watching the way people moved around one another, offering comfort in small, rehearsed gestures. And then I saw her again. Not in reflection this time, but directly, standing beside a man I recognized as Edward's attorney, Jonathan Reeves. She leaned slightly toward him, her posture composed, her expression attentive. But there was something too focused in the way she held his attention, something that did not belong in a room meant for remembrance. I did not need to hear every word to understand the shape of the conversation. I saw the way she nodded at certain points, the way her lips curved into a polite smile when he responded, the way she tilted her head just enough to appear concerned, while still guiding the direction of what was being said. It was practiced, intentional. I moved a few steps closer, not enough to interrupt, but enough to catch fragments as the space between conversations shifted. Words like timeline and arrangements reached me in pieces, soft and controlled, as if they were being handled with care, but not out of respect, out of strategy. Jonathan's expression remained professional, measured in the way that comes from years of listening without reacting too quickly. But I noticed the slight pause before he answered her next question, the brief hesitation that suggested he understood more than he was willing to say in that moment. Ashley noticed it too. I saw it in the way her smile held just a fraction longer than necessary, in the way her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass before relaxing again. When she finally stepped back, thanking him with a tone that sounded perfectly appropriate to anyone not paying close attention, she turned and her eyes met mine across the room. For a brief second, neither of us looked away. There was no embarrassment in her expression, no attempt to explain or soften what she had been doing, only a calm, almost assessing look, as if she were measuring how much I had seen and how much I understood. I lowered my gaze first, not because I felt uncertain, but because I did not need her to know the answer to that question. Instead, I set my untouched coffee on the nearest table and adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, giving my hands something to do while my thoughts arranged themselves into something clearer. Around me, the room continued as if nothing had shifted, as if this were simply another gathering marked by polite conversation and shared memory. Daniel approached me then, his expression careful, his voice soft as he asked if I was holding up all right. I studied his face for a moment, searching for any sign that he had noticed the same things I had, that he had heard the same fragments, that he had understood the direction in which everything was quietly moving. But his eyes held only concern of the most surface kind, the kind that checks a box rather than asks a question. I nodded once, telling him I was fine, because explaining anything in that moment would have required a kind of openness I was no longer willing to offer. He squeezed my shoulder gently before turning back toward the center of the room, where Ashley now stood speaking with a group of relatives, her voice light, her demeanor perfectly composed, as if she had not just spent the past several minutes discussing matters that did not belong to her. I watched her for a while longer, noting the ease with which she moved from one conversation to another, the way she adapted her tone depending on who stood in front of her, the subtle shifts that made her seem exactly what each person expected her to be. It was not something I had fully recognized before, or perhaps I had and simply chosen not to name it, but standing there, with the weight of everything I had heard and remembered settling into place, I could no longer ignore the pattern. This was not a moment of poor judgment or a single conversation taken out of context. It was a continuation, a progression, and the realization did not come with a surge of anger or even sadness, but with a quiet certainty that felt far more steady than either. I reached for my coat, folding it carefully over my arm, and took one last look around the room that had been filled with voices honoring a life, while something else entirely had begun to take shape just beneath the surface. Then I turned toward the exit, moving slowly, deliberately, as if nothing at all had changed, even though I now understood that everything had. I did not go back to the house right away after I left the reception, even though it was only a 15-minute drive down the same quiet streets Edward and I had traveled together for years. Instead, I sat in the car with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the dashboard, as if time itself had slowed just enough to let everything settle. The silence inside the car felt different from the silence inside the chapel. It was not filled with expectations or polite restraint. It was clear, uninterrupted, and it allowed my thoughts to move without interference. One by one, the memories began to return, not in a rush, but in a steady sequence, each one connecting to the next with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. I remembered the afternoon Ashley had insisted on helping me reorganize the filing cabinet in the study, her fingers moving quickly through folders that had not been touched in years, her questions framed as concern, but always circling back to what was where, what was signed, what still needed attention. At the time, I had stood beside her, answering gently, even thanking her for taking an interest, telling myself that it was a kindness, that she was trying to ease the burden. But now I could see the way she had paused just slightly longer over certain documents, the way her eyes had scanned more than they needed to, the way she had suggested we simplify things by grouping accounts together.
I remembered how Daniel had supported the idea without hesitation, how he had said it would be easier for everyone if things were clear, his voice carrying that same quiet trust he had always had when he was younger, the kind that assumes the people around him mean well. I had not argued then. I had not questioned it. After all, I had spent my entire life making things easier for my family, smoothing over small concerns before they could grow into something larger. It had become second nature to say yes, to accommodate, to believe that cooperation was the same as harmony. Another memory followed, this one from a Sunday afternoon not long before Edward's health had begun to decline more noticeably. Ashley had brought over a neatly printed document, placing it on the kitchen table with a calm confidence that made it seem routine. "Just something to look over," she had said, her tone light, almost dismissive, as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. It had been a list, organized and precise, outlining what she called future considerations, including the house, the accounts, even the possibility of relocating to something smaller. I had read it slowly, feeling a quiet discomfort I could not quite explain at the time, and when I had asked why it was necessary, she had smiled and said it was simply being prepared. "It is better to think ahead," she had added, her voice steady, her eyes watching me carefully for a reaction. Edward had been in the next room then, resting, and I had folded the paper neatly before setting it aside, telling her we would discuss it later. We never did. Or rather, we did not in the way she had intended. Because looking back now, I realized that each of those moments had not been isolated. They had been steps, small and measured, building towards something that had already taken shape in her mind long before it became visible to me. The pattern was no longer something I had to search for. It was there, clear and undeniable, stretching across months of conversations, suggestions, and quiet observations that I had chosen to interpret as care. I exhaled slowly, my fingers loosening their grip on the steering wheel, as the last of the tension I had been holding settled into something steadier, something more controlled. Outside, a car passed by, its movement brief and unremarkable, a reminder that the world continued as it always did, indifferent to the realizations that changed everything for the people inside it. I reached for my purse, retrieving the small set of keys that felt heavier than they had that morning, and after a moment I started the engine. The sound was familiar, grounding, and as I pulled out onto the road, I did so with a calm that did not come from denial, but from understanding. Because for the first time, I was no longer trying to make sense of scattered pieces. I was seeing the full picture. And once something is seen that clearly, it cannot be unseen. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, quiet and still beneath the soft glow of the porch light, as if nothing inside it had shifted in the past few hours, or even the past few months. I sat there for a moment longer before stepping out, letting the familiar outline of the front door settle in my mind, remembering all the times Edward had stood there waiting for me, holding it open with that small, patient smile that never needed explanation. The key turned smoothly in the lock, the sound precise and ordinary, and when I stepped inside, the air carried that same faint scent of his cologne mixed with old wood and something warm that had always made this place feel like ours. I set my purse down on the small table by the entrance and removed my gloves slowly, placing them beside it with care, as if each movement needed to be deliberate, measured, fully understood. The silence here was different from the car, heavier, filled with echoes that had not yet faded. I walked into the living room and paused, my eyes drawn to the armchair near the window, where Edward used to sit every evening, a book resting in his lap, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose as he read. The book was still there, exactly where he had left it, a small marker tucked neatly between the pages, as if he intended to return to it later. I did not touch it. Instead, I turned toward the hallway that led to the study, my steps steady, guided by something I could not ignore anymore. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall, unchanged, its surface clean,
its contents organized in the same careful way they had always been. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking at it, remembering Ashley's hands moving through those drawers, her voice calm, her question so neatly phrased. Then I reached for the handle and opened it. The folders inside were exactly where they should be, labeled in Edward's handwriting, each one precise, intentional, unmistakably his. I pulled out the first one that caught my attention, flipping it open slowly, not because I expected to find something hidden, but because I needed to see it again with different eyes. The documents were familiar: account summaries, property records, insurance details, all arranged with a clarity that reflected the way Edward approached everything in his life. Nothing careless, nothing unfinished. I moved to the next folder, then the next, my movements unhurried, my thoughts aligning with each page I turned. And then I noticed it, a document I did not recognize, placed neatly between two others, its edges perfectly aligned, as if it had always been there, even though I knew it had not. I slid it out carefully, unfolding it just enough to read the heading. It was a draft, not finalized, but detailed, outlining a proposed transfer structure, one that shifted control of several key assets in a way that felt too convenient, too direct. My name was there, but only as a step, not as a destination. The language was clear enough to understand, even without legal training. It was not written to protect me. It was written to move past me. I stood there for a long moment, holding that single sheet of paper, feeling the weight of it settle into place alongside everything else I had begun to understand. This had not come from Edward. I knew his language, his precision, the way he phrased things when it mattered. This was different. Structured, yes, but lacking the careful balance he always maintained. I folded the paper back along its original lines and returned it to the folder, exactly where I had found it, aligning the edges as precisely as before. Then I closed the drawer gently, the soft click of it sealing something more than just documents inside. I did not rush. I did not react. Instead, I walked back into the living room and sat down in the armchair across from Edward's, placing my hands in my lap and letting the quiet settle around me once more. Because now, there was no longer any doubt. The questions, the conversations, the timing, the way Ashley had spoken earlier that day, all of it connected with a clarity that did not need confirmation. She had not been preparing for the future. She had been shaping it. And for the first time, I understood that whatever had been set in motion was not finished. Not yet.
I did not sleep that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind had finally become too clear to ignore what it was seeing. The house remained quiet around me, each room holding its place as if nothing had shifted, but I could feel the difference in the way I moved through it. Slower, more deliberate, as though I were no longer simply living in it, but observing it. I sat at the dining table long after the lights in the neighborhood had gone out, a single lamp casting a soft circle of light across the polished surface, and I let every detail settle into something I could understand, without emotion clouding it. By morning, I had already made one decision. I would not confront Ashley. Not yet. Confrontation would only give her something to react to, something to adjust around, and from everything I had seen, she was very good at adjusting. Instead, I would do what I had always done best. I would remain still, and I would watch. When the phone rang just after 9, I already knew who it would be before I reached for it. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember the boy he used to be before answering. His voice was gentle, careful, asking how I was doing, whether I needed anything, whether I had plans for the day. I answered in the same tone, steady and calm, telling him I was fine, that I was taking things one step at a time. There was a pause then, a small one, but long enough to feel intentional. Ashley was thinking it might be a good idea for us to come by later, he said, his words measured, as if he were trying to present the idea in the best possible light, just to help you sort through some things. Papers, accounts, that kind of stuff. I let the silence stretch just slightly before responding.
Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to place the moment where I needed it. "That sounds thoughtful," I said quietly. "I will be here." When I hung up, I did not move right away. Instead, I sat there, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into place. It was sooner than I expected, but not surprising. If anything, it confirmed what I already knew. She was moving forward. The rest of the morning passed slowly, not because there was nothing to do, but because I chose not to rush through any of it. I made coffee, using the same measurements Edward had always insisted on, letting the familiar routine steady me. I opened the curtains, allowing the light to fill the room in a way that made everything look almost unchanged. I even took the time to water the small plants by the window, each action grounding me further in the space that had been mine for so long. When I returned to the study, I did not open the filing cabinet again. There was no need. I already knew what was inside, and more importantly, I understood what it meant. Instead, I sat at Edward's desk, my fingers resting lightly against the surface, tracing the faint marks left by years of use. There, in the top drawer, was something I had not thought about in months, perhaps even longer. I opened it carefully, revealing a smaller, locked compartment that Edward had always kept separate from the rest of his papers. He had never hidden its existence from me, only its contents, with a quiet assurance that if I ever needed to see what was inside, I would know how. At the time, I had not asked questions. I had trusted him completely. Now, that trust felt less like something passive and more like something he had prepared me for. I reached for the key ring in my purse, my fingers moving without hesitation, selecting the small, unmarked key I had carried for years without using. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a soft, precise click, and for a moment I simply held the handle, aware that whatever lay inside would not be there by accident. When I opened it, I did not rush. Inside were several documents, neatly arranged, along with a sealed envelope bearing my name in Edward's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The slight slant of the letters, the careful spacing, unmistakably his. I did not open it yet. Instead, I closed the compartment gently and leaned back in the chair, my eyes fixed on the desk in front of me, as everything aligned into something unmistakable. Edward had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to prepare. Enough to leave something behind that was not meant to be found until it was needed. And as I sat there, the morning light shifting slightly across the room, I understood that whatever Ashley believed she had already set in motion, she had not accounted for this. She had been planning her next steps, but Edward had already taken his. I placed the key back into my purse before I heard the car pull into the driveway, making sure the drawer was closed exactly as I had found it, every detail returned to its original place so that nothing appeared disturbed. The envelope remained inside the compartment, unopened, not because I did not want to know what it contained, but because I understood that timing mattered more than curiosity. By the time the front door opened, I was already in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a fresh pot of coffee, the scent filling the room in a way that felt almost normal. Daniel stepped in first, his movements familiar, his expression softened with concern. But behind him, Ashley entered with that same composed presence, her eyes taking in the room in a single quiet sweep before settling on me. "You should not be doing all this alone," she said, her voice smooth, measured, as she set her handbag down with practiced ease. "We are here to help." I smiled, a small, controlled gesture, and nodded as if her words carried only kindness. "That is very thoughtful," I replied, my tone steady, giving her nothing to push against. Daniel moved closer, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder, asking again if I was all right, and I answered the same way I had earlier, calm, composed, unchanged. I watched them both carefully, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the quiet way one observes something that has already revealed its pattern. Ashley wasted little time. Within minutes, she had guided the conversation toward practical matters, suggesting we sit down and go over a few things while everything was still fresh. She spoke as if she were organizing a routine task, her words structured, efficient, leaving little space for hesitation.
Daniel nodded along, taking a seat at the table, his trust in her direction as natural as it had always been. I joined them, folding my hands lightly in front of me, allowing her to lead exactly as she intended. She began with simple questions, asking about accounts, insurance policies, property details, each one framed as a necessity, each one delivered with just enough softness to avoid sounding intrusive. I answered selectively, offering only what was already obvious, nothing more, nothing that would move beyond the surface she expected. When she suggested we look at the documents in the study, I hesitated, just long enough to make it believable, then agreed, rising slowly as if the idea required effort. In the study, she moved directly to the filing cabinet, her confidence barely concealed beneath a layer of politeness. I stepped aside, allowing her access, watching as she opened the drawers with the same familiarity she had shown before. Her fingers moved quickly, scanning labels, pulling out folders, her focus narrowing with each passing second. Daniel stood nearby, observing, trusting, unaware of the precision in her movements. I remained near the doorway, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, as if this were exactly what I needed. When she reached the folder containing the document I had seen earlier, I noticed the slight change in her breathing, the almost imperceptible pause before she opened it. Her eyes moved across the page, and for a moment something sharpened in her expression, something satisfied, as if she had just confirmed what she had been expecting to find. "This is what I was talking about," she said, turning slightly so Daniel could see, her voice carrying a note of quiet authority. "It looks like there were already plans in place to streamline everything." Daniel leaned in, reading, nodding slowly, as the structure of it made sense to him in the way these things often do when presented clearly. I did not move. I did not interrupt. I simply watched, letting the moment unfold exactly as she needed it to. Because now I understood something she did not. She believed she had found what mattered. She believed she was one step ahead. And as she closed the folder and continued explaining what should be done next, her confidence growing with each word, I felt that same stillness settle inside me again. Not from uncertainty, but from knowing that the real decisions had not yet been placed on the table, not the ones that would matter most. Daniel did not speak immediately after he finished reading, and in that silence, I could see something shifting behind his eyes, something that had been steady for years now, beginning to move in a different direction. He looked down at the page again, slower this time, as if searching for a detail he might have missed. But the meaning did not change with a second reading. It was clear, structured, unmistakable. Edward had not left things open to interpretation. He had made decisions, deliberate ones, and he had written them in a way that left no space for adjustment or influence after the fact. Ashley stepped closer, her voice carefully controlled as she asked to see the document, her tone still composed, but no longer as certain as it had been before. Daniel handed it to her without argument, his movements quieter now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. I watched as her eyes moved across the page, her expression remaining steady at first, then tightening slightly at the corners, the smallest shift that most people would not notice, but one that spoke clearly enough to me. She read quickly, then again more slowly, as if the second pass might reveal a different outcome. It did not. The room held its silence, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet recognition that something had not gone according to plan. Ashley lowered the paper slightly, her gaze lifting toward me, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no immediate response, no polished explanation ready to follow. Only a pause. "This must be an earlier version," she said finally, her voice measured, searching for a foothold that was no longer there. "Things change. We should verify this with the attorney." I met her eyes calmly, not challenging, not agreeing, simply allowing the weight of what had already been written to stand on its own. "You are welcome to do that," I said, my tone even, without resistance. Daniel spoke then, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, as if he were speaking more to himself than to either of us.
It says everything was placed in trust, he said slowly. With Mom as the sole decision maker, nothing gets transferred without her approval. He looked up at me then, really looked, as if seeing something he had overlooked for a long time. I held his gaze for a moment, not with accusation, but with a kind of clarity that did not need to be explained. Ashley straightened slightly, her composure returning in layers, rebuilding itself around the new reality she was being forced to accept. That is one interpretation, she said, choosing her words carefully now, each one placed with intention. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without giving it direction. Of course, I replied. Properly matters. The words settled between us, carrying more meaning than the sentence itself. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left that needed immediate clarification. The document had done its work. The assumptions that had filled the room earlier had been replaced with something more solid, something that could not be shaped by tone or suggestion. After a moment, Daniel folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the desk, his movements slower, more thoughtful, as if each action now required consideration.
Ashley stepped back slightly, her attention no longer fixed on control, but on recalculation. Her mind already working through what this meant, what could still be done, what had shifted beyond her reach. I turned away from the desk then, not abruptly, not as a gesture, but simply because there was nothing more for me to do in that moment. I walked toward the doorway, pausing just long enough to glance once more at the room that had held so many quiet decisions over the years. Your father understood people very well, I said, my voice calm, almost reflective, as if I were speaking about something distant rather than something that had just unfolded in front of us. Daniel did not answer, but I could see that he was listening in a way he had not been before. I continued into the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, leaving them behind with the document, with the silence, with the realization that not everything can be guided once it has already been decided. In the living room, I paused beside Edward's chair, resting my hand lightly against the back of it, feeling the familiar shape beneath my fingers. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was not filled with uncertainty or unanswered questions. It was settled, clear. And as I stood there, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see. I had spent years believing that keeping peace meant giving space, that understanding meant stepping back, that family would always hold itself together if you were patient enough. But now I saw it differently. Peace is not something you protect by staying silent. It is something you protect by knowing when silence is no longer the right answer. I did not feel anger. I did not feel regret.